I'm Dean Laura Padilla-Walker, and I'm happy to welcome you to our honored alumni lecture for the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. Let's begin with an opening prayer offered by Jesse Moore, a junior in political science and co-president of the Peacemaker Project. Following the prayer, Dallin Bundy, a senior in political science, Truman Scholar, and co-president of the BYU Political Affairs Society, will introduce Ambassador Flake. Nice to have you.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to be gathered here today at BYU, united in our desire to increase our understanding of truth and to learn and grow. We're grateful for education, and we're grateful for our teachers and leaders who inspire us and teach us more about the world around us. We are so grateful to be able to hear from Ambassador Flake and to learn from his experience in service and leadership. Please help us to have open hearts and minds today, that we may be able to be open to understanding and inspiration to help build peace throughout the world and to find ways to serve those around us. We say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Ambassador Jeff Flake's political career is a byproduct of his BYU education. He finished his master's in political science on Capitol Hill as a part of BYU's Washington Seminar program. 2 years later, he put his bachelor's in international relations to use in the African country of Namibia, where he directed a foundation assisting Namibia's independence process. In 2000, he ran for Congress and won a seat representing Arizona's 6th congressional district, where he served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He won a Senate seat in 2012, joining the Committee on Foreign Relations and chairing the subcommittee on Africa. After retiring from the Senate, Jeff was nominated to be U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Turkey, where he helped secure Sweden's accession to NATO. In appreciation, he was awarded knighthood by the government of Sweden. Jeff and his wife Cheryl are parents to 5 children. They divide their time between Arizona, where he directs ASU's Institute of Politics, and Utah, where he is chair of the World Trade Center, Utah. On a personal note, I actually had the privilege of meeting Ambassador Flake last year while completing a study abroad with 30 other BYU students. We passed through Turkey at the end of our trip, and the ambassador was gracious enough to invite all of us to his residence and host a de facto BYU pizza party. Having been away from the States for several months and just finishing finals, we were grateful to let loose a little bit. To this day, I can't believe that the ambassador let so many college students into the residence of the U.S. ambassador. He was gracious and personable, and it speaks to his quality leadership and his genuine love for BYU. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jeff Flake.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Dallin, for that kind introduction. It is wonderful to be here, to be back on BYU's campus. And I am really appreciative of this honor, and I'm grateful. BYU means a great deal to Cheryl and me and our entire family. We met at BYU, although we met on the beach at a faraway campus. For some still unknown reason, we transferred to this campus in January. I have no idea what we were thinking. All of our 5 children have attended BYU. We bleed blue. We can all sing the BYU fight song by heart online. Nobody can do that. Nobody can do that. But anyway, I have to say that I'm slightly more invested in BYU than Cheryl, because I carry a Y chromosome and she doesn't. It's just the way it is, Cheryl, but I don't hold it against her. But for most of my life, I have loved survival stories. Most involve sailing. For a kid growing up on a dry, dusty ranch in northern Arizona, the open ocean appealed to me. Sailing adventures gone bad, that was my favorite genre. Whether it was Ernest Shackleton's epic survival on an ice floe off Antarctica, or Stephen Callahan's harrowing survival 76 days adrift in a life raft. I couldn't get enough of these stories. Each time I would finish one of these tales, I would find myself wondering, what if that were me? If I were stranded on a deserted island with only the bare essentials, could I make it? Finally, after about 25 years of marriage, Cheryl told me, if this is your midlife crisis, why don't you get it over with? Why don't you just maroon yourself already? So I decided to do it. I opened Google Earth and found a cluster of tiny, uninhabited islands smack in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And during the August congressional recess in 2009, I flew alone from Arizona to Hawaii, from Hawaii to Majuro in the Marshall Islands, and then on to Kwajalein. From Kwajalein, I hired a small fishing boat to take me about 3 hours out to a deserted island called Jabinwad, which in Marshallese means the end of the reef. I brought only the bare essentials with me, a pole spear, a machete, a magnifying glass to start a fire, and a hammock to sleep in. That was about it. No food or water. I told the fishermen to come back in a week, and I hoped that they would remember. But I'll never forget that first night, lying in a hammock, strung between two coconut trees in the island's jungle interior. If you've ever seen the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, you'll remember how terrified he was when he heard strange noises at night. He was convinced he wasn't alone. He eventually discovered it was just coconuts dropping from a great height onto the ground with a heavy thud. I can tell you, I heard the same thing. Every time a coconut fell, it just about scared the life out of me. My biggest worry was that I wouldn't be able to spear enough fish in shark-infested waters. This was actually a picture of one I took. Or I worried that I wouldn't be able to start a fire, or that I might get sick drinking coconut water. As it turned out, while all of these were challenging, those weren't the hardest part. I managed to spear enough fish while competing with sharks who clearly thought that it was their reef. I started a fire. I avoided getting knocked out by falling coconuts. But what I didn't anticipate was the real challenge, the crushing loneliness that set in on the first night and never left me. I was so starved for companionship that I started befriending the hermit crabs that wandered through my camp. I'd talk to them as if they were neighbors just wandering by. After a few days, I could swear they started to recognize me. But by the third day, I got a little stir-crazy. I pulled out a Sharpie marker that somehow made it into my meager survival kit. I picked up a crab and wrote number 1 on his shell. I wanted to know if these were all different crabs or just the same ones doing endless laps around my camp. So I picked up the next crab and wrote number 2. This is number 19. By the end of the week, I had 126 numbered friends. I still miss number 72. We developed an addiction to coconut scraps. I was not so fond of number 12, who pinched my big toe. Tom Hanks had a volleyball named Wilson. I had numbered hermit crabs. But in an age that glorifies alpha dominance, we're told that strength means going it alone, that success is forged through sheer willpower or force of personality. But if I've learned anything from surviving on islands or life itself, it's that the opposite is true. Real progress, real happiness, and change don't spring from fear or control. They're built on trust, and trust that grows not through grand gestures, but through the smallest acts of kindness and respect. I arrived in the House of Representatives in my mid-30s, back in January of 2001. I was full of vim, vigor, and the naive conviction that I could single-handedly change the world. It didn't take long for me to realize I'd joined a body of 435 other legislators, each with their own firmly held belief about the proper role of government. Most of them arrived with the same lofty expectations that I carried. One of my earliest goals in Congress was to eliminate a practice called earmarking, where members would direct federal funds to pet projects at home. Now, the fiercest defender of the practice of earmarking was the ranking Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee, David Obey. He was a formidable lawmaker who served in the Congress for more than 30 years. Every time I stood up on the House floor to challenge earmarks, David Obey would rise up on the other side of the aisle to swat me down, usually with a reminder, very painfully accurate, of my naivete and inexperience. It happened so often I began to wonder that if I ordered a cheeseburger at the House cafeteria, that David Obey might pop up behind the counter and challenge my order. That's why what happened next was so extraordinary and so surprising. During debate on an appropriation bill, I rose in the House chamber to offer an amendment that would lift the travel ban on Americans visiting Cuba. As an aside, I've always believed that if we really wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro, we would have made him deal with spring break once or twice. I think he would have waved the white flag of surrender pretty quickly. But anyway, when I introduced my amendment, a fellow Republican, a Republican like me, a colleague, stood up and said, "The gentleman from Arizona just wants to lift the travel ban so he can drink mojitos on the beach in Cuba." Now, because this is a BYU audience, I should explain that a mojito is a rum-based drink popular in Cuba. Not that I would know from personal experience, mind you. But usually when Republicans start going after each other, Democrats sit back, grab some popcorn, and enjoy the show. And I'll admit, we do the same thing when it's Democrats turning on each other. So imagine my surprise when I saw David Obey, the same David Obey who relished swatting me down at every opportunity on the House floor, suddenly rise and object. He demanded that the words about mojitos be stricken from the record, be taken down, as it's called. I was stunned, in disbelief, and I walked over and said, "Mr. Obey, why would you protect me like that?" He leaned in and said, "Ah, Flake, I know you're Mormon." He said, "I know you don't drink. Somebody had to protect your honor." My amendment passed. Over the next decade, Chairman Obey and I still sparred plenty over earmarks, right up until his retirement in 2011. But after that moment, our backs and forths were done in good faith and often in good humor. As it turned out, the practice of earmarking itself ended that same year of his retirement. But by the time I arrived in the U.S. Senate in 2013, partisanship in that body had reached a fever pitch. The place was so divided. But as bad as things could get in Washington, every once in a while you're reminded of the best in human nature, even in the middle of all that noise. There used to be a Senate tradition called pairing. If a senator who supported a bill or a nomination had to miss a vote, maybe for a child's wedding or a family funeral, they would find a colleague on the other side who disagreed with them on the issue, and that colleague would agree not to vote. The idea was simple. It kept the overall vote tally the same as if the absent senator had been there. Now, as you can imagine, in today's political climate, any senator who paired a vote with somebody from the other party would face some serious backlash from his own party. That old courtesy, that bit of grace, has all but disappeared. But then, in April of 2018, something remarkable happened. The president's nominee for Secretary of State came before the Committee on Foreign Relations, on which I sat. In that environment, almost any nominee from a Republican president faced near universal opposition from the Democrats. Johnny Isakson, a Republican senator from Georgia, was battling Parkinson's disease, and he had already announced that he would retire at the end of his term. But on the day of the vote, Senator Isakson was away delivering the eulogy for a close friend. His absence meant that Democrats had a real chance to block the nomination from reaching the Senate floor, until Democratic Senator Chris Coons stepped forward and changed his vote from no to present, allowing the nomination to reach the floor as if his Republican friend, Senator Isakson, had been there to vote. I still remember Bob Corker, the chairman of the committee, breaking down and crying as he addressed the reporters outside of the room. These days, we're not used to such expressions of sympathy, of compassion, and peacemaking. When kindness is displayed, trust is developed. And when trust is developed, working relationships emerge. During my time in the Senate, Senator Coons and I collaborated on a lot. We traveled around the world in our assignments on the Foreign Relations Committee. In fact, I was once with Senator Coons when we were chased by a herd of elephants in Mozambique. You might think that these symbols of the Republican Party would have shown a little more respect for a Republican senator. But maybe that says a little more than I'd like to admit about my standing in today's GOP. I'll tell them you clapped at that. 2 years after retiring from the Senate in 2019, I was nominated by President Biden to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Turkey. I was thrilled, honored, really. But my wife, Cheryl, was quick to bring me back to earth. When we were in college, Cheryl spent 2.5 weeks touring Turkey as a member of the BYU Young Ambassadors, singing and dancing her way around the country. This is an article written during that time. That's Cheryl on the left, with brown hair at that time, I should add. But she reminded me of that, and she said, "I was a young ambassador to Turkey. It's time for you to be the old one." I had to admit, she had me there. But now, speaking of islands, it's often said that there are island countries, but no country is truly an island. In today's world of trade, commerce, and global supply chains, nations, like people, are interconnected and interdependent. At the time of my nomination, relations between the United States and Turkey were, to put it mildly, a bit strained. A previous U.S. ambassador had been all but shunned by the Turkish government in his final year. And just a month before my arrival, the ambassador I was set to replace had nearly been declared persona non grata and kicked out of the country. So perhaps the only reason the Turkish government agreed to accept my credentials was something that had happened a few years earlier. Back in 2015, when there was campaign talk here about imposing a Muslim ban, Cheryl and I, along with our 2 youngest boys, attended Friday prayers at a mosque in Scottsdale to show our support for religious freedom. A video of the brief remarks I gave that day, talking about the shared values between Mormons and Muslims, made its way around Turkey after my nomination. That may have helped soften the opposition to my appointment. Still, when I arrived in Turkey's capital, Ankara, this is how I was greeted by President Erdogan. Believe it or not, this is his happy face. But as ambassador, I was determined to live by the bit of wisdom my mother kept taped to our refrigerator when I was growing up, a 3x5 card that read, "Assume the best, look for the good." That was there on the refrigerator throughout my childhood. Now, to be sure, Turkey had taken a number of steps that had frustrated Washington. But if you were willing to look, there was still a lot of good to be found. Turkey was hosting nearly 4 million refugees, more than any other country in the world by far, and doing so at enormous political and economic cost to its own citizens. In nearly every public statement I made a point of thanking the Turkish people for their generosity, for their big Muslim heart in opening their doors to refugees from Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and even China. And when the Turkish government hesitated to accept U.S. search and rescue teams after a massive earthquake in February of 2023, I reminded them that Turkey had long been there for others, sending its own search and rescue teams to natural disasters on 5 continents. They had paid it forward. Now it was time to let others return the favor. They did. I should note as an aside that no group was more generous than the people of Utah in helping with earthquake relief. In diplomacy, the most valuable currency isn't power, it's trust. And trust is built on kindness and respect. Now, just 6 weeks after we arrived in Turkey, Russia invaded Ukraine. Almost overnight, Sweden and Finland realized that neutrality was a bit overrated. Both sought the protection of NATO membership. But of course, admitting new NATO members requires unanimous approval from all existing NATO members. And Turkey, a longtime member of the alliance, had serious concerns with Sweden, citing its tolerance of the PKK, a terrorist organization that has threatened Turkey's national security for decades. Now, with 29 other NATO countries eager to bring Sweden into the fold, the instinct in Washington was to turn up the pressure, to lecture Turkey, to threaten sanctions. There was even talking about trying to sideline them from the alliance altogether. But I knew that diplomacy, not coercion, was the only viable path forward. We desperately needed Turkey, with its second largest military in NATO after the United States, to remain fully engaged in the alliance. Now, Sweden had real steps to take, including constitutional and statutory changes to address Turkey's security concerns. These were steps that Sweden was reluctant to take. And Turkey, for its part, needed to show its own people that Sweden would strengthen, admitting Sweden would strengthen Turkey's own security, not weaken it. There was deep skepticism on the Turkish street and in Turkey's parliament about Sweden's motives. Meanwhile, the United States had its own part to play, particularly by advancing long-stalled sales of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. That sale would improve NATO's interoperability and Turkey's defense, but several members of Congress strongly opposed it. What followed was an 18-month stretch of highly technical, carefully choreographed diplomacy. It took legislative finesse, constant coordination with allies, and more patience than I thought I ever possessed. Above all, though, it required trust. Trust built not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of kindness and respect, by assuming the best and looking for the good. In the end, it came right down to the wire, but Sweden was welcomed into NATO. Turkey's legitimate concerns were addressed, and the United States reaffirmed its place as a reliable partner and a leader within the alliance. And perhaps best of all, when I finished my time in Turkey and announced I'd be headed home, President Erdogan invited me to his palace. He handed me two parting gifts, a beautiful vase and a wide smile. Quite the change from the expression he greeted me with when I arrived nearly 3 years before. I still choose to believe the smile was just, not because I was there, but because I was leaving. I hoped he was sad about that, but I can never be sure. So, absent marooning ourselves on an island, how do we survive and thrive in today's polarized, politicized world? How do we use small acts of kindness to build trust and to become peacemakers? Not everyone can be a legislator, but all of us, every one of us, can be diplomats and peacemakers in our own relationships and daily interactions. Last year, the Washington Post ran a story about a man from Utah named Jake, who was being sentenced for entering the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. Jake was reacting to what he was convinced was a rigged election. At his sentencing, the judge read a letter from a woman named Andrea, pleading for leniency on Jake's behalf. Andrea's politics were nothing like Jake's. In fact, she despised what had happened at the Capitol that day. But in her letter, she wrote that she knew this man and that the actions of one day should not define his life. I've learned, she said, not to judge people by their worst day. How did she learn this lesson? Nearly a decade earlier, Andrea, drunk behind the wheel, caused a car accident in Colorado that took a young woman's life. The victim was Jake's sister. And yet Jake and his family, convinced of Andrea's genuine remorse, went to court and asked the judge to shorten her sentence. A year later, they successfully petitioned for her early release. Now, years later, Andrea wrote to Jake's judge, "It's unfathomable," she said, "for a family to look at the person who killed their daughter and sister and wish her a happy life. Yet Jake and his family did. Because of their compassion, I've been given a second chance to live a meaningful, productive life. She asked the judge to do the same for Jake, not to judge him by his worst day. When I catch myself being judgmental or self-righteous or anything less than diplomatic, I think of the kindness depicted in this story. I'm reminded that grace, not grievance, is what truly changes people and nations. Now, during my week of island solitude, I watched a manta ray dance gracefully with a grouper atop a coral head, but it didn't mean as much because there was nobody there to see it with me. I made it to shore after being circled by sharks, each one eager to steal the mackerel off my spear. But the hermit crabs didn't exactly line up to high-five me when I reached the beach. I witnessed 7 of the most spectacular sunsets the sky has ever produced, yet I had no one to share them with. When that little fishing boat came back to pick me up after a week, I climbed aboard, sunburned, hungry, and grateful. And as I looked back and watched my tiny island fade into the horizon, I realized something. I hadn't proven my independence at all. I'd proven my dependence on people, on connection, on grace. We are not meant to live alone or to see the world only through our own eyes. I knew then that I needed the comfort and joy that comes from being around family, neighbors, colleagues, and friends. We all do. That's where real happiness lies. Thank you for having me here today.